Good evening, everyone. My name is Lois Harder, and I am the principal of the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this extraordinary encounter with the Lougheed College lectures on this coronavirus day. As we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. Reconciliation should be a central concern for 21st century leaders, and territorial acknowledgement is one small gesture in that important project. And I would also like to thank our sponsor, Syncrude, for supporting these lectures and, by extension, leadership development here at the university. The Peter Lougheed Leadership College was established in 2015 with the help of several generous donors and the support of the Lougheed family. Peter Lougheed was himself a talented young leader in his university days and the president of the Students' Union, a member of the Golden Bears football team, and president of Delta Epsilon fraternity. He would go on to study law here at the U of A and gain an MBA from Harvard, play football professionally in Edmonton, and, of course, have a very storied career as Alberta's first progressive conservative premier, a post he held from 1971 till 1985. Peter Lougheed's dedication to a publicly spirited leadership was unassailable, and that dedication certainly inspires the work of the college named in his honor. The PLLC is an interdisciplinary center for leadership education. It aims to equip people with knowledge and skills that will enable them to engage with diverse people and ideas and build their leadership capacity. PLLC programming includes courses and a certificate program for undergraduate students. And if you know young undergraduate students who might be interested in that, we currently have applications open, so encourage them to apply. We also offer leadership development workshops for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, and leadership development collaborations within the university and with various communities, business and government partners. The college has a dynamic mentorship program, and all of the undergraduate certificate students engage in community service through a leadership passion project, formerly known as a stretch experience. We also host this inspiring Lougheed College lecture series, this year organized around the theme of what comes next for Alberta, which seems an especially poignant question tonight. With new governments here in Alberta and federally, intensifying pressure to address climate change and diversify Alberta's economy, difficult negotiations around Indigenous land rights, and a series of transformations, technological, generational, organizational. The series invites people to grapple with pressing issues and debates. And of course, in this last week, we have more fodder for leadership thinking. Stock market plummets, pandemics, geopolitical wrangling. Of course, leadership always matters, but I don't think it's too dramatic to say now more than ever. So our next lecture, if indeed there is a next lecture in this academic year, is scheduled for Thursday, April 9th at 6:30. We're obviously considering how best to host that event. But the topic for the moment is precision health, the future of healthcare, with two dynamic speakers from the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry here at the U of A, Dr. Nish Panu and Dr. Amit Bhavsar. And tonight we are asking for donations to the campus food bank. If you didn't bring perishable items with you, you can certainly donate to them online. So now, for the reason you're all here, we are thrilled to have Chris Turner here, present in the flesh, fantastic, to discuss our energy future. Chris is an author, essayist, and strategist, and a foremost authority on climate change solutions for Canada and the global energy transition. His latest book is The Patch, The People, Pipelines, and Politics of the Oil Sands, which is a national bestseller and winner of the 2018 National Business Book Award. Chris is also the author of the bestsellers The Leap and The Geography of Hope, both of which were National Business Award finalists. His 2014 book, How to Breathe Underwater, an essay collection, won the City of Calgary W.O. Mitchell Book Prize. His feature reporting on energy, climate, and sustainability issues has won 10 National Magazine Awards and appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, The Walrus, Maclean's, and many other publications. He was a 2013 writer-in-residence at the Berton House in Dawson City, Yukon, and a 2010 Paul D. Fleck Fellow at the Banff Centre. He lives in Calgary, and we are very delighted that he is here with us this evening. So, 1 second. Chris will speak for 40-ish, 45-ish minutes. And there will be an opportunity for Q&A after that. We've handed out some slips of paper, and people who are watching us live stream can also type in their questions, and then we're going to use a program in order to ask those questions to keep the virus contagion at bay. So I hope you'll bear with us on that. So please do submit your questions as Chris's talk proceeds or as the discussion proceeds. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks, first of all, to the university and to the Peter Lougheed Leadership College for giving me the chance to come and talk to you tonight. Obviously, you know, the sort of rapidly unfolding events of the week were not necessarily what we were hoping for a backdrop. But, you know, thank you all for venturing out. I think there'll probably be a lot less of this venturing out for a lot of us for a little while. I always feel strangely at home in these sort of sudden, jarring changes because I've spent so much of the last 20 years talking to people, thinking about working on the idea of change, the idea that it's coming quite a lot quicker than we recognize, that the world that is coming toward us is going to be very different from the world before. So not to go too far into that, just to sort of say off the top that I think it shouldn't surprise us that we are seeing change on this scale, and there's often extraordinary opportunity that can come out of this. When I first started writing on this topic, one of my kind of guiding lights was a book called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, fantastic American essayist. And she's also written extensively on how really, really large-scale disaster through the centuries has actually been a great time of sort of renewal and repurposing for a lot of human societies, because we do tend to really actually set aside a lot of what separates us and get down to how can we work together to get everyone through a problem like this. So hopefully that is the spirit that you know, certainly that we've seen before when we face great challenges in this province and this country, and hopefully will continue to dominate the next couple of weeks. Before we move on from that topic, which you know is sort of surrounding us, hopefully not literally, here in the room, if nothing else from my presentation or anything else, you remember everyone's being kind of barraged with a lot of information about what to be doing about this coronavirus. So I thought I would throw my little hat in the ring. The only important thing of all of the expert advice, the very first thing, if the only thing you do about this thing is wash your hands more often, you have done a lot to help us slow down the spread of this thing. There's this fantastic online thing called Wash Your Lyrics, where you pick your favorite song and it will show you 20 seconds of good hand washing to it. Alberta Bound, it turns out, by Gordon Lightfoot, fits very, very well. You end right on the chorus. So use that or whatever you'd like. But anyway, we all should. As soon as you leave here, highly recommend wash your hands, wash them when you get home. Just make it a habit every single time you come in and out of any environment for the next little while, and we will all get through this. So let's move on to how Alberta can lead in the global energy transition, and let me begin by talking about that energy transition and why it's happening, and then I will get to the extraordinary opportunity that I think it represents. So to begin with, what we're, you know, sort of in very simple terms, what we're talking about is a shift in the primary energy basis of the entire global economy from predominantly fossil fuels to predominantly non-emitting sources, basically at this point as fast as we can manage without, you know, extraordinary disruption, and while, you know, maintaining, you know, a society that continues to function for everyone. The time frame on that, everyone's got a different sort of estimate, but really, as I hope I'll make clear over the course of the evening, it's moving faster than we would have expected 10 years ago, not as fast as climate scientists would like to see it move, but there is no question anymore. This transition is absolutely underway around the world. It's very large, it's getting bigger and faster, and it's a massive opportunity for Alberta and for Canada to show real leadership and to see extraordinary new opportunity as that transition unfolds. We'll get back around to that, but just so we're all on the same page, what is this transition? What's driving it? What's driving it, of course, is the problem of climate change and our collective response to it. This has been something we've been grappling with for a couple of decades now. There's been a great acceleration, though, that I think began right around the 2015 Paris climate talks, where a lot of sort of half measures and semi-coordinated gestures became a much larger and more coordinated thing, not because the Paris Climate Agreement in and of itself contained the kind of policy teeth that was going to move the world to a net zero or low carbon economy anytime soon, but because it recognized what was increasingly manifest, which was that there was this energy transition underway, that the scale of the climate problem and the nearness of its threat was severe enough that we all had to begin acting as soon as possible, and that the world's industrial economies, the world's developing economies, basically, almost everyone could agree there's a way forward here that actually leads to something not just that mitigates climate, but gets us to a better future. In the meantime, in the years since that, because things don't move as quick as some would like, what we've seen is an extraordinary renewal in the amount of public unrest, public protest, particularly led by young people, students, people who are looking to a future that looks terrifyingly uncertain to them. And a lot of what I've tried to do, I certainly would never want to diminish the scale and intensity and scope of the problem, the urgency of those calls from the Fridays for Future and other strike movements, but to move from that place of sort of fear and despair and terror to a recognition that how we are going to, because the scope of the change is so large. You look at, actually, this is not a bad example. You look at our collective response right this instant to the coronavirus. We recognize that this is potentially an acute crisis. If all of us can, and we are taking extraordinary measures, if we shut down major sports, if we shut down theaters and other places where people gather, start testing people, bring in these protocols to keep from touching each other too much and spreading the germs, we recognize that can get us fairly quickly past the crisis point. The crisis point in the climate crisis is decades long. And so the response to it inevitably is not just going to be to get everyone mobilized in fear and panic, as some of us are right now about the coronavirus. It's going to take a much more sort of thoroughgoing, slow, kind of messy process to get where we're going. The good news is that process is now about 20 years old and is really beginning to take off. And it's happening in so many different ways and on so many different fronts that it's kind of hard to get a beat on. And you can hear, we've barely begun to flatten global emissions. The world is still reliant for more than 80% of its primary energy use on fossil fuels. And you hear those numbers and you think, well, not that much is happening. But the fact is that the sort of engine of this transformation, this transition, has now been built and is beginning to really, really fire at an extraordinary rate. I won't bombard you with numbers because it's really more about the story of change than any particular statistic, but we have seen just an extraordinary collapse in the price of solar, wind, other renewable energy sources. Countries like China increasingly driving this transition with more than $100 billion invested every year in new energy technologies and that sort of thing. It is moving, even though it seems like not fast enough to some people, or maybe not big enough to carry the weight that the fossil fuel economy does. I can tell you, after more than 15 years covering this stuff, that we now exist in a world of renewable energy and clean energy technology and the rest of it that seemed potentially not even possible when I started writing about it. I remember solar energy advocates, people whose job it was to talk about what a great technology this was 15 years ago, who would have absolutely shied away from guessing that we would see solar energy being deployed at the scale that, for example, China now deploys it. China, every single year now, deploys more than 50 gigawatts of new solar energy on its grids. That is more than 10 times all the solar in the world everywhere when I started writing about this stuff 15 years ago. So it really is accelerating rapidly. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. It creates jobs. It builds prosperity. It does a lot of the stuff that the current economy does, and it does it in some ways a lot better, and that's something I'll come back to in a minute. When we talk about leadership in this, though, what does leadership look like? And that's another one of these places where it can get very easy to get bogged down in any particular country's current footprint or how fast their emissions are moving or whatever else, and then sort of miss the bigger picture for all that. For example, one of the countries that we often look at for leadership is Germany. And to be fair, the German countryside increasingly looks like this. Germany took an early lead among the major industrial nations in driving this transition to non-fossil fuels or to non-emitting fuels, particularly in areas like wind and solar. The solar industry, for example, was basically taken from cottage to mainstream by German engineers and German investors. It's now dominated by the Chinese, but the Germans did the heavy lifting over the last 20 years. Along the way, more than 300,000 jobs created in Germany. If you do anything in the sort of clean energy, energy efficiency, any of these fields, it's German technology driving it, German design driving it. They really did become extraordinary leaders. And along the way, to their credit, Germany began where its national electricity grid, more than 95% of it was non-renewable less than 5% of it was renewable energy, so tiny little percentage. And they're now well over 40%. Sometimes on particularly windy and sunny days, you might get up into the 60, 70% of the national grid in Germany is drawing from non-emitting sources, from renewable sources. And so when we think about leadership, we think, well, that's an extraordinary achievement that the Germans have made, and we justly celebrate it, and I'm not denigrating it at all. But if we ever talked about Canada's national energy grid, we never do, national electricity grid. We talk about Alberta's coal, and we talk about hydro in BC and Ontario nuclear, or whatever else. When we talk about it nationally, 81% of Canada's electricity grid is non-emitting. Now, the bulk of that is not newfangled solar panels. It's huge hydroelectric dams and some nuclear and a few other things. But we never, ever think of it as a national asset, as a head start that we have as a country on most of the world. We have opportunity and a starting line that most of what we think of as the world's leaders, some of these Northern European nations that kind of drive this conversation, would be absolutely, be thanking their lucky stars to have that. And I think if we begin to talk about where Canada could lead, by talking about that as well, and this does not excuse the fact that our emissions are growing. This does not excuse the fact that there's some stuff we're not doing well at all, but to at least acknowledge, hey, we've got some pretty good resources to draw on here. We can start from a pretty good place, and we can really do some amazing things. One of the other things I'll mention and come back to is that Canada's sort of messy pile of policies around this stuff is actually considered by people who, gather for UN conferences, for example, to be among the best kind of jumbles of policies that anyone's put together. Because everyone recognizes climate change is really, really messy. It's really hard to get stuff enacted. In the German case, for example, they avoided going straight at coal and the emissions from coal because the policymakers, this was 20 years ago now, recognized if we come straight at coal, we'll lose. What we have to do is go and build a new industrial basis that is as compelling, as powerful, as money-making as coal, and then we will be able to turn to the coal industry and say, sorry, your time is through. And that moment actually came for Germany just last year when they announced that they will be phasing out coal in the next 20 years. But they didn't do that first, and they still have some of their own problems to deal with. So I think I mention all that to say no one's way out ahead in this. We all began from wherever we began, and we've messily fussed through this first period, this sort of period of how do we do less bad? How do we make less of a mess of the planet? How do we slow down the rate at which we are intensifying the catastrophe? The great thing is that there is this thing that I think of as sort of the much better value proposition emerging. And if you think about what I mean by a value proposition, let me take you through that. The 20th century, particularly the post-war period of the 20th century, had sort of a value proposition to it, an idea of, even if it wasn't accessible to all, an idea of these Western democracies emerging out of the catastrophe of war, saying, we will create prosperity, we will apply technology and money and freedom and an increasingly progressive and liberal democratic state to provide you with a better life, a home in the suburbs, a car in the garage, a backyard where your kids can play, beautiful new highways to take you everywhere you want to go. And that was an extraordinary, compelling vision, particularly here in Canada. This was the consumer choice. All you have to do, you don't even have to go to a big city to find that suburban ideal. Most of our smaller cities and towns now are built to sort of that suburban ideal of the car in the driveway and the split level house and the rest of it. Extraordinarily compelling value proposition for a lot of Canada. and for a lot of the world, to the point where even now, where we are in a very, very different emerging energy paradigm, this is still how you sell a sport utility vehicle, is by parking it in front of a large suburban house far away from anyone else's house and say, you know, don't you want your little country estate on the edge of the city? Is that not you know, the sort of dream of the whole thing? To the point where this is also how when they go to sell what I consider to be the much better value proposition, that's often how they situate it. And this is compelling for mainly because you can take the entire 20th century value proposition, swap out zero emitting technology, and it still looks pretty decent to most people's eyes. It's not going without, it's not great sacrifice. In this case, this is how Tesla sells its suite of next generation technologies: the electric car in the garage, the solar panels that are built right into the roofing tile that are providing a lot of the power, and then big batteries that store that energy and that intermittent energy so that it can be fed to your car and to everything else when you need it. That's Tesla's, you know, sort of value proposition. And what's exciting about this, to my mind, is not the suburban house and the rest of it. Really, what's exciting about this is the car, first of all. And the reason the car is exciting, at least to my eyes, is because the car was the piece of it that looked like it was furthest off when I started talking about this stuff. About, was it 17, 18 years ago now? I remember I went to this electric car show in Montreal. All the world's sort of next generation low-emitting automobiles. Ford at the time was playing around with hydrogen. They had a hydrogen car that spat clean water out its tailpipe. That was very cool. Hybrids were big at the time. There was a lot of different things. The one thing there wasn't was the single best engineered car on the road as an electric vehicle built by some dot-com billionaire, because no one saw that coming. And that really was this extraordinary shift in the way we think of zero-emitting technology. Tesla didn't start out to build non-emitting electric cars. It started out with the design intent of building the best car on the road, and that's what they've built. It's the fastest car on the road. It's the safest car on the road. I always wind up getting hung up on that one because Volvo built its entire multi-decade brand on being the safest car on the road. The Tesla is significantly safer, to the point where Teslas break the testing machines that are testing to see if they can crumple the box that you're sitting in tests, because you no longer have to protect an engine. So you just have way more sort of design options in terms of protecting the little center where you're sitting in the event of a crash. They don't even, Tesla is so much better on so many different fronts, they don't even talk about it. When you look at their advertising and marketing, they never talk about safety, even though it's an extremely safe car in an accident. It's also, you know, the next generation of technology. You can fix it with a software patch, all that kind of stuff. But the main thing here is that they are not saying, we want you to do less bad, don't have a tailpipe on your car. They're saying, we want you to do much better. How about you have, you know, just a really great car that happens to be electric? How about if your house could be a place where you could produce energy and then store it for when you need it to fuel your car and go off to work? Oh, and by the way, the house will sort of still look the way it did, but we're just going to integrate solar right into it so that next time you need to change your roof, it'll be a solar roof instead of you know, whatever else, cedar shingles or whatever you got right now. So that's sort of the Tesla value proposition. And it's an exciting one. It's extremely compelling. It's Silicon Valley. It's high tech. It looks, I think, to a lot of people's eyes like that, you know, there will be some tiny little luxury enclave of that. And that's where they are now. You know, there's an island in Hawaii, Kauai, where you can find the incredibly exclusive $5 million home community where the houses actually look like that. But the reason I find it exciting is because it is taking all of this emerging technology to reduce our carbon footprint and saying, let's not just talk about reducing carbon footprint, let's talk about doing things much better. And that wouldn't be as compelling if it was just Tesla talking about it. The great thing is you can find a much more sort of workaday version of this in some of the other places where they're the furthest ahead on this technology and design. Denmark, for example, was one of the leading countries in that first wave of climate change action, not because Danes are inherently more altruistic or virtuous or whatever than the rest of us. It was that the energy crisis of the 1970s hit Denmark that badly, that they were much more quickly and urgently compelled to switch to new fuel sources after the 1970s crisis, which is how they became, among other things, a world leader in wind energy. More than half the Danish grid, somewhere around half the Danish grid now is wind powered. most of the time. Their goal is to eventually get to an entirely fossil fuel-free grid within the next couple of decades. And when they started pursuing this goal, they realized they didn't just have to rethink where they got their power from. They had to rethink how do you set up a modern society? How do you get power to a modern society if you're not using this sort of old model of the grid? And so they tasked some very smart people in the Danish Energy Agency, the Danish Technical University, IBM, Siemens, a bunch of other companies, and this was the model they came up with. And it's markedly similar to what Tesla developed with this sort of high-tech, sleek, futuristic idea in mind. Again, you've got intermittent renewable energy. In this case, this is a Danish island called Bornholm. Bornholm already something like 60 or 70% of their power comes from wind, so it was a good place to test it out. The idea was that at the time, and this was 10 years ago, energy storage looked like it was too far off to be counted on, to be a standalone technology, that it wouldn't be affordable. So what if we assume that there's going to be, when we need this at a national scale in 10 or 15 years, hundreds of thousands of electric cars on the road? Well, then you have this vast distributed battery that you can use most of the time, because most of us leave our cars parked somewhere most of the time. And so that was what they used for their model, and then they brought in smart grid technology to begin making good choices and tested it out over the last 10 years, 8 years, I guess, at scale on the island of Bornholm. And this was not a computer model or simulation. They actually went to the island of Bornholm. It's a lovely island. It's a place where Copenhageners will sometimes keep vacation cottages, that kind of thing. It's rural, agrarian, pretty, rugged. It's where the best aquavit comes from, that kind of thing. And they went to 1,900 homes and businesses, hooked them all up to this new smart grid, and everyone went about their lives in their very unassuming Danish way for the next 8 years. And there were changes and improvements, and there was multiple phases, and a whole lot of interesting technology got played around with. This is some of it. Things like some solar power, the jumble of stuff in the bottom picture there is various smart grid technologies, electric vehicle charging stations, battery packs to balance the grid, the rest of it. The upshot is this island in Denmark ran a modern society for several years without any significant technical glitches on 100% renewable energy. From a technical standpoint, they've essentially proven the concept. The same thing that we see happening with Tesla and the power walls and the fancy solar tiles, in a very, as you can see, much less sexy kind of Danish way. There it is, we did it. We now have to figure out how to do it at much larger scale, at much cheaper prices, and the rest of it. But we've proven that this is a thing. We're not off in some crazy direction. And the reason I mention that is because I've spent a lot of the last 15 years seeing things with my own eyes and then telling people about them, and then them telling me that, no, that doesn't work. And I have to, yes, it does. I've been there. I remember, I'm actually going to show you a house. This gets to this value proposition. These houses right here these are townhomes outside of the city of Freiburg in Germany. All of them produce more energy than they use over the course of a year. They're not just net zero, they're net energy producing. And this was one of those things that people would tell me wasn't happening. And so I went back a couple of years after I first wrote about it and got people to show me their power bills and took pictures of their power bills, so that if anyone ever asked me again, I could say, here is data showing that all of these units make more energy than they use over the course of the year. And this is the first piece of that 21st century value proposition, that much better way of doing things. It's not just, wouldn't it be nice to live in a house that's net zero, I'll feel good about my carbon footprint. It's, wouldn't you like to be able to make some of your own power, possibly broker it back to the grid when you don't need it at a premium even? That technology now exists. You can do that in part by finally making smart decisions about when and how you use energy. One of the things, this has been true as long as I've been writing about this stuff, they've tried this in all different societies all over the world. If all you do is give people clear information about their energy use, you don't change how they're using energy, you just put the meter inside the house, put it on a smartphone, show people this is how much power you're using right now in your house. They will use less because they're shocked to find out that there's all this power being used for no good reason. And so that is one of the things that right now it's all very clunky technology, but I think before too long, some people already have some version of this on their phone. You will have an app that shows you all of the stuff using power. You'll be able to switch it on and off remotely. Your refrigerator and stuff like that, which is a big power hog when it really needs power, will be able to make decisions on its own, is is there demand really high right now? Is demand dropping in an hour? Should I maybe wait an hour before I do my refrigerating? You, as the owner of the refrigerator, don't care when that happens. You only care that things stay cold. So why not make a smart choice about that instead of just having the thing kick in when it hits some sort of temperature threshold? So that's already there. And then, of course, you've got the Tesla. I'm not going to talk as much tonight about urban design. I think there's a lot of things that we should be doing without cars as we build 21st century cities. But if you do have a car and you do drive it to work and leave it sitting there all day and it's an electric car, you can absolutely connect it back to the grid, and that power can be sold back because you don't need it. And if you do it, smartly, presumably at a premium. For example, in the Danish example, they're doing 5-minute incremental pricing. So if the wind's blowing at night, you're buying power and fueling up your car on the cheap, and then you're parking it in the middle of the day when everyone needs power, you could absolutely get a premium for that. The way that's mainly happening right now is that the power companies are doing that for the very few customers who have electric cars. But I don't think we're far off from people being able to be power brokers as well as power users over the course of their day. So that's the value proposition. It's not just Tesla. It's also the Danes. It's also the Chinese who are building things like electric buses at a pace and a scale that is hard to fathom for those of us who watch LRT lines take forever to get built in this country. 90,000 bus fleets being rolled out all electric in Chinese cities over the last few years, that sort of thing. Another great example of leadership in this is Siemens, the German engineering giant. I mentioned German leadership in this stuff. Siemens, this is their permanent trade show space in London, which was built for the 2012 Olympics, and then they decided to just leave it there because they realized this was, an ongoing conversation. Inside are basically, it's for bureaucrats and policymakers and investors to see how you would build a 21st century city, primarily using electricity for most of daily needs, mapping out, what kind of technologies you need. And Siemens recognizes this is so much the future of their company that they have this permanent trade show space now in London. And have built, one of Europe's largest engineering firms. They basically bet that entire firm on the success of this model. So that's that inevitability piece. That's when I talk about this energy transition being inevitable. I think when we see it in the political arena, it looks paper thin. But under behind all of that is actual technology, actual jobs, real business happening at extraordinary scale. And what's more, there are extraordinary opportunities for Canada in this transition, and we've actually begun, thinking sort of systemically about what does that mean for Canada. This is a Natural Resources Canada report that I participated in the sort of production of with a roundtable of non-government people, mainly industry and public sector or sort of public advocacy and that sort of thing. Everyone from oil and gas guys to hardcore Greens came together and said 20 years out, what does Canada look like in a somewhat best case, not a dreamy scenario, but if we make good choices, if we decide, yes, we are going to take a leadership position in this energy transition, we are going to recognize that we are still going to have a lot of conventional energy resources, oil and gas and other stuff to produce and sell to the world, but we will increasingly put priority on reducing our own carbon footprint, producing technology in the renewable energy and energy efficiency sphere that we can also sell internationally as well as use ourselves. What does that look like? And it's a pretty compelling vision, and it's a realistic vision of a real balance of those two things, where we're not suddenly shifting dramatically from one to the other. It's more of a shift of emphasis, and it's a recognition that there's a great opportunity there for Canada, for Canadian people, for Canadian companies to take leadership roles, and it's a leadership that is already visible on the ground. These are just a handful of examples of the kind of stuff that report got into, that a lot of this sort of future thinking gets into. Among other things, the next 10 years, next 15 years, despite appearances, are going to be a huge boom for infrastructure construction in this country. We are going to be spending more on new infrastructure, transport infrastructure and everything else than we have for a very long time, and that will include things like that new LRT line in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is the one that isn't having all the problems. Ottawa is the one, obviously, if you follow these things, has just been a disaster. But we will be seeing more and more of that kind of investment. And in that is huge opportunity to get it right this time. Our existing infrastructure, a lot of it was built on the assumption of really, really cheap energy. And as soon as you change that thinking, you change the way you build stuff. There's a good example right there in the photo. That is an apartment building in Vancouver recently constructed. That is a passive house apartment building, net zero overall for energy. Passive house design, if you aren't familiar with it, is actually a thing that was sort of the first invention around it anyway, actually happened in Canada in the 1970s. When we thought we were going to take energy efficiency seriously back in the 70s, we, among other things, invested, as made a lot of sense, in how do you insulate a building better than we ever have before. That led to this sort of model home in Saskatchewan that was, way, way, way more efficient than most of the stuff we're building today. The Germans took that design, turned it into a system called the passive house system, and have now kind of exported it back to us, and now we build apartment buildings to those specs in downtown Vancouver. This doesn't just mean new technology, though. One of the things we talked about in that Generation Energy report is what does the future of oil and gas look like if we intend to be, and this is, in the absolute best case scenario where we keep global emissions and global temperature warming below 2 degrees Celsius, the entire world basically gets serious enough about climate change, not to stop it entirely, but to mitigate the really scary scenarios that are out there. What gets us there, and what does it look like? In even the rosiest of those scenarios, by mid-century, you're still looking at 70-odd million barrels of oil a day being used, a significant but shrinking chunk of natural gas, and coal has basically almost all but vanished. So what does the technology that drives that look like? And it includes stuff like these pictures here. The one on your left is Carbon Cure. You can't really see the technology, but what Carbon Cure is doing, they're a Halifax-based company. They are figuring out ways to sequester carbon dioxide in the production of concrete. Concrete's a huge CO2 emitter in the process. There's a huge opportunity there for it not only to reduce its emissions in production, but become a place where we can sink carbon right in the buildings. And so that's just one technology. They're one of the finalists for the Carbon X Prize, which is sponsored by oil companies here in Alberta to try and find next generation technology. The other thing you're looking at there, those big fans, that's the technology being played around with by a company called Carbon Engineering. Some of you may remember or still might be following the career of a guy named David Keith, who was at the University of Calgary for a number of years, went off to Harvard, and then a company sort of grew around his technology. Carbon Engineering, their gamble is that eventually we'll be able to just pull carbon dioxide right out of the air. And since a lot of those even really rosy scenarios for 20, 30 years out require us to sequester a lot of CO2, we won't be able to shrink it all just by shifting from fossil to non-fossil sources. We are going to need, at some point in the next 20 years, a huge building boom in carbon sequestration. And if you can do it, as Carbon Engineering thinks it can, simply by pulling the CO2 right out of the air, that would be like a Microsoft level of sort of corporate innovation. That would be the company that does that affordably would have as many customers as it could possibly build stuff to serve. So really, really exciting stuff kind of across the board. The tricky part here is that people don't really react to numbers, figures, megawatts, even talk about innovation, which I think most of us, we hear innovation and we assume whatever's being talked about isn't real because it gets talked about everything. And so story is a very important piece of this. And so this was one of the things I wanted to address, particularly around Canada's leadership role, Alberta's place in Canada's leadership role, because obviously the story of this energy transition here in Alberta has been largely a story of conflict, disagreement, pitting one sector of the economy against another, accusations of who's doing good and who's doing bad, arguments over pipelines and oil sands and the rest of it. And I think when we have those arguments, and they're, in my opinion, just an extraordinary waste of our sort of social and political capital as a country to be at each other's throats about these individual pieces of infrastructure. A lot of what's going on there is an argument being spoken essentially in two different languages. And so one of the things I wanted to do this evening was just talk about these two different languages. The first of the languages is a language that in my oil sands book, The Patch, I call the high modern language. And the high modern language, when I talked about that 20th century value proposition, that sort of split level suburbia, better living through chemistry, all that stuff, that was the high modern worldview. That's just the idea that, the kind of purpose of a modern technological society is to go build big stuff, find lots of energy to fuel it, build more stuff. We've got this huge deposit of oil in northern Alberta. We can't figure out for decades and decades how to turn it into usable, sellable energy. And then, wow, 1967, Great Canadian Oil Sands opens the first oil sands mine. What an extraordinary achievement for the country. This is exactly, the ribbon cutting kind of thing. In the other picture there, you can see Jean Chrétien Syriza, believe it or not, a Liberal Prime Minister who took extraordinary personal interest throughout his career in the success of the oil sands, was instrumental in the deal that kept Syncrude from collapsing in 1974, and then was there with his hard hat on the moment they and the Alberta government agreed on a new royalty system and a new tax system that triggered the boom that most of us in this room lived through here in this province, and some of us probably think, it would be great if that could come back again. That was the high modern ideal. That was, the sort of 20th century ideal of the whole point of the project is to get stuff done, great engineers, brilliant scientific minds, let's build stuff. And that voice and that worldview looks at the conversation today around pipelines and oil sands and the rest of it and thinks, why are we having this stupid argument about these kind of marginal matters? We're talking about the nuts and bolts here of modern society and the world needs our energy and the rest of it. And that goes right past the other voice. The other voice is what I think of as the Anthropocene voice. Anthropocene, if you're not familiar with the term, basically means man-made. It is the increasingly scientifically valid term for the geologic epoch that we live in, because we've made changes to the Earth's atmosphere and at geological scale to the point where we've left a footprint permanently as a species in the geologic record. And that Anthropocene worldview began as basically just a critique of the high modern, saying, these giant factories, these huge mines and the rest of it that you're building are causing too much problems. Can you do a little less bad? But what's happening, of course, is that voice, particularly in the last 5 years, but I would say more like the last 20, has begun to enunciate an entirely competing worldview. And whether we like it or not in Alberta, whether we think it's great or bad, that is the worldview and that is the point of view that is winning the day. Whatever we become as a province, whatever we become as a country, will have to reconcile itself with a low-carbon world, with an Anthropocene worldview, where the value is not just on getting stuff done and putting a bunch of energy to work, but on balance, on doing more with less, on shrinking footprints, on avoiding the climate crisis. And that unavoidability of that is where you see that really, really intense conflict here and in a lot of other places. And what you wind up seeing often is the Anthropocene story being confronted with or bombarded with sort of, high modern facts. Those solar panels, you could never have enough. No, you people you just want to destroy the world, and they basically just talk past each other, and nothing great gets done. And for somewhere like Alberta, the great tragedy of that, one of the great tragedies of that, is that we don't get to really tell the story. The story gets told however people want to tell it. This is a great example of that. Many of you will recognize the top photo is an oil sands mine. That is, for those who are familiar with the 3 million barrels of oil a day that we pull out of northern Alberta, beyond this province, that is the most common image. That is their, if you have an image of your mine in the oil sands outside of Alberta, this would probably be it, a huge strip mine. Part of the shock of that is prior to the opposition to the growth of the oil sands, most people hadn't seen photos of strip mines. They all look like that. A copper strip mine looks like that. That's just what a giant, modern mine looks like. But this got permanently attached to Alberta's energy story. And that meant when Alberta tried to tell the story in the bottom picture, that's a SAGD facility. That's this much smaller, some of you are probably very familiar with it, the kind of stuff where most of the growth now is in the oil sands industry, where the majority of the oil now comes from, is not from mining, but from this sort of drilling operation involving steam and the rest of it, much smaller footprint on the earth, a problematic carbon footprint, but not unsolvable with the right technology. And so, a number of companies in Alberta, when they started seeing this sort of climate argument, said, hey, we're not against climate action, and look at the great things we're doing, and can we talk about SAGD well pads instead of oil sands mines? And that just got completely swamped by a different story that they didn't know how to navigate and didn't understand the language and terrain of. And I would argue we're still, to a large measure, in this province today, stuck in that spot where a lot of our leadership does not understand the terrain they're standing on, does not know how to talk in a language that anyone outside of their their crew of people who already agree with them understand. And that's where you get things like the $30 million war room that only talks to itself, as far as I can tell, and occasionally embarrasses itself on a larger stage. Anyway, so what do we do going forward? I think the first thing is we recognize that Anthropocene voice is not going away. It's going to get louder and more insistent. Things like, I like to point at Carbon Tracker because it's a bunch of financial wonks who started looking at numbers first in the coal industry in Europe, and they looked at what they considered to be unburnable assets, stranded assets, and began doing really, really good accounting that I can tell you that bankers in places like London find much more compelling than whoever Jason Kenney brought with him that week in terms of what is and isn't a risky investment. Things like the Green New Deal, I would argue, and a lot of others would as well, Canada already has most of what's in America's Green New Deal, but the idea of this big shift to something new is incredibly compelling to a lot of people, and I think will only get more compelling as the current system begins to show signs of its age, and I think we're living in a very extreme example of that this week for sure. This is definitely a time when people are going to be very open to the idea that maybe we should be doing things a bit differently than whatever got us here. One last Canadian example outside the oil patch of how you would make that leadership case. So Canada, among other things, is a very large producer of aluminum. And aluminum is as messy as any, it's mining bauxite and stuff like that. It's not clean by most people's eyes, but nobody thinks of aluminum and thinks giant mines. They think of aluminum and they think cans. When Apple thinks of aluminum, they think of all kinds of stuff in this made of it. And Apple wanted to green its operations. They wanted to make aluminum without creating any CO2. And so they went and partnered with a company in Quebec. They went to Quebec partially because there's already a lot of aluminum smelting there, but also because Quebec has an essentially entirely emissions-free grid, thanks to all the hydro. And so now, in a couple of years, Apple will be able to say, hey, there's no CO2 in the production of these things, and it will be because of Quebec's grid and Canadian aluminum. So that's the kind of stuff, that's the kind of story, much more than this us against them, let's fight over pipelines thing, that I think we need to be telling. And we can be telling it in Canada, and particularly here in Alberta, a lot more clearly. We have, this is just a couple of examples, extraordinary wind resources that would be the envy of most countries in the world. Obviously, the reddish colors are the best places. The best stuff is obviously on ocean coasts and that sort of thing, but you'll look at most of southern Alberta has reasonably decent wind resources, some of which we've begun to exploit. Alberta's in even better shape when it comes to solar resource. Canada's solar energy heartland is that bright red spot on the southern chunk of the prairies, including the area around Medicine Hat and south of there. Over the course of a year, the amount of available solar resource around Medicine Hat in southeastern Alberta is about equal to the amount of solar resource available in Rio de Janeiro. We don't think of them as having a similar climate because they don't, but the solar panels do not care if it's minus 20. If the sun's shining, that's good solar resource, and that's actually world-class solar resource right here in Alberta. Germany is there in the picture there because Germany obviously has done, many times over more solar energy deployment than Canada has with way crappier resource. So it's just to kind of illustrate the point that we are and could be a solar energy leader both in this province and beyond. Now, part of the reason that hasn't happened everywhere yet in this country is, again, about story. The story around Canada's energy transition has been a really messy one to date. So messy, in fact, that the province that most fully embraced this transition, Ontario, turned into one of the worst places in the world to do renewable energy deployment. I won't go all the way into that because we don't have another 2 hours, but basically what happened in Ontario was that no one thought about what change means to people when they said, hey, we're getting rid of coal and bringing in renewable energy and we're subsidizing renewable energy. It never occurred to them, hey, maybe we should go talk to the people in the communities who are going to be affected by this, about why change is happening and the opportunity that they might have out of this and why it might be good for them. And so instead what you got was people who were so angry at the Liberal government, the previous Liberal government in Ontario, that there were grassroots anti-solar protests. Now, you'll find anti-wind protests all over the world because these are giant things that spin and people kind of get freaked out about them. But most people think solar is good. They don't have any problem with it in and of itself, except in rural Ontario, where just outside of Kingston, these are not file photos. I took them driving through Inverary, Ontario, because I had never seen grassroots anti-solar campaigns before. That was how much and how badly the conversation went about this energy transition in Ontario, to the point where most of the renewable energy industry has sort of abandoned that marketplace. They've said it'll be years before anyone will allow any kind of renewable energy development there. Let's move on to other places like Alberta. So how does Alberta get it right, where Ontario got it wrong? Well, we can begin by looking at best practices. The Danes, for example, do renewable energy really well. And one of the things they do, and one of the things they've done, is make it a story about Denmark doing great things. And one of the ways they've done this is not by saying, oh, look how many megawatts, look at this technology, but by going to places like Samsø. This is an island in Denmark. This was the first 100% renewable energy powered island. They had to, pull a couple of fast ones in terms of cars and ferries and that sort of thing to balance out so that they were net zero, as opposed to actually literally not having any more fossil fuels on the island, but they did do it. And the way they did it, again, was not the Ontario way of just slapping a bunch of technology on people, whether they wanted it or not. Instead, it was this very, very careful, town by town, village by village process of finding people in those communities who wanted, who could be, sort of inspired to change, and then giving them the tools to change and making it their story. And this was not done by finding the renewable energy zealots. My favorite story of how Samsø became this renewable energy island comes from the village of Nordby. And Samsø is not that big, but even still there are biases about the north end of the island versus the south end of the island. The north end of the island, where Nordby is, that's the conservative part of the island. They don't like change. So the guys who were charged with bringing in this energy transition, when they'd gotten the funding and the approval and it was going to happen, the first thing they did was go to the most conservative town on the island, to the local inn where people were meeting already to talk about liquor licensing. There's a lot of tourism on the island, so there's a very important thing. And the renewable energy people got up and they did not do a half-hour PowerPoint presentation. They simply said, we know you're here to talk about liquor licensing. That's the important thing today. We're going to talk to you after a little bit about this renewable energy island thing you've maybe heard about. The beers are on us tonight. Have a great meeting. And when you talk to the guys who did this, they would tell you no one wanted to stay for their presentation, but felt like, oh, well, they bought the beer, so we'll stay. And they basically said, look, we don't think that you guys are going to want to lead this change. We think the rest of the island is going to lead this change. But if the community got together and you could get more than, I can't remember what the threshold was, 60 or 70% of the community to sign off on a renewable energy project, we could get something done. And so the very first piece of the renewable energy puzzle on Samsø was a solar thermal plant in that town, because those people had decided they wanted it rather than that it was going to be imposed upon them. And that's a really important, where you see the best success stories are where the people thought, this is what we want, not this is what we have to accept. Very similar story in the town of Hardin, Iowa. Iowa is definitely not, a heartland of progressive climate action or anything like that, but there are a lot of farmers looking for new ways to make money. And Iowa at one point set up this opportunity where you could do wind energy fairly easily. And a bunch of farmers in this town of Hardin got together and formed a co-op, which was new to them and kind of weird, but all right, and put up 8 wind turbines. And the amazing thing about this, and I only mention it because I think, we think of Danes and we think of, progress is in their bones. They ride bikes everywhere. This is their kind of thing. Not 100% true, but that's what we think. Whereas you look at Iowa and you think a bunch of farmers in Iowa got together and became, wind turbine operators. And the amazing thing about the Hardin story is not just that they did that, but that the whole town, because it was these local guys who did it, the whole town decided it was their wind farm. None of them, only the 8 farmers had investment in it. But when I went there, you would talk to the guys who owned it, and they would say, I go to the gas station to fill up my car, and like the guy at the cashier at the gas station will say, hey, I noticed a couple of turbines aren't turning today. What's that all about? Like, people were just wanted to know what the community wind farm was doing. And that kind of ownership and that kind of buy-in is, I think, incredibly important as we enter this next phase, to find ways that this is not just about, megawatts and power purchase agreements and all this terminology that we don't understand, but there's real opportunity for people in this province and this country to see new opportunities from that. We are, here in Alberta, are starting to see and have been for a while now, large-scale wind, some smaller-scale wind. There's some interesting opportunities in the solar space. All over the province, some sort of next generation stuff happening in some of the buildings that we're building. In this case, that's Walmart's distribution center outside of Calgary, which was built to the sort of absolute maximum efficiency it possibly could, and also has solar and wind and the rest of it. At this point, one of the things that's been tough even for the people who are doing this kind of stuff. And there's First Nations are doing this. There's a company called Greengate in Calgary that just signed an agreement to do a $500 million wind farm or solar farm that will be the largest solar installation in Canada. They do these things almost, I wouldn't say despite what's happening in the province and in the country, but kind of off to the side of it. So the largest solar farm in Canada is going to be built starting later this year in southern Alberta. And it doesn't fit into anyone's political narrative. It's not on the hot radar when we talk about how is Alberta's economy doing and where are we creating jobs and how are we going to diversify. And yet that is where that opportunity lies. And it's happening basically with Greengate's new solar installation. It's happening because no one tried to stop it more than that anyone tried to encourage it. Not to get into the details of it, but basically the new government left the NDP's procurement stuff alone when it changed all the energy and climate policies, and that wound up creating enough of a pathway that you could still get a $500 million solar project approved. A lot of the financing is coming not from Alberta, but from a company in Copenhagen that does international renewable energy development. And one of the other things that has fed some of the renewable energy boom in Alberta is you can get credits on the California market for building renewable energy anywhere. And so you can build a wind farm in Alberta and finance it in part by getting credits on the California emissions market. So all of this is to say the opportunity is so great here that we're succeeding in it almost despite ourselves. Imagine if we decided that that was where we wanted to put a lot more of our effort and energy into not, fighting to hang on to the place we're at, but to say, hey, there's really great opportunity where we need to go. And that will absolutely include an oil and gas industry that continues to produce a lot of oil and gas for a good while and hopefully innovates to the point where we no longer have to fight about their carbon footprint, even if we probably will still have to fight about things like pipelines. But the larger point being that there's just a huge opportunity sitting there. And so when we talk about what is, where do we go next? Clearly, we're at a bit of a transition, a bit of a crossroads for this province economically, and much else. That opportunity is staring us in the face. It's not going anywhere. It's going to happen somewhere. One of the many unexplored chunks of this renewable energy economy is geothermal power, which involves drilling large holes in the earth, which is something we do quite well in Alberta. There's an opportunity we haven't fully explored, and lots else besides. So I'm going to leave it there. Invite you to feel free to be in touch. Often when I give talks like this, there'll be somebody in the audience who knows more about one of the things I'm talking about than I do. That's pretty typical for a journalist. You know a little about a lot of things as opposed to a lot about a single thing. So feel free to be in touch. I welcome your questions now, and thank you all for your time and attention. So how do we do the questions?
I will ask them. If you want to ask questions, I will read them along as you produce them here. So this one struck me. I'm not sure who the asker is, but the question is, I sometimes hear the argument, Canada produces less than 1% of the world's emissions. Mm-hmm. So even if we completely stopped all emissions, it really wouldn't make a difference. So how would you respond to that position?
Right, and I've certainly heard that as well. It's 1.6% at the most recent counting. Okay. But one way to answer that is, what is the threshold at which emissions matter? There are a handful of other, major industrial countries at 2, 3, 5% of global emissions. Do they get a free pass too? Is it only China and the United States? Are they the only ones who have to reduce their emissions? That's one piece of it. The other piece I would say is that as one of the world's leading industrial countries, we have a more than 100-year head start on a lot of the emerging large emitters like China and India. So I think we owe the world a greater response to the crisis that we've helped create. But the third part of that is we fix our emissions because leading the fight to fix emissions is the future of the global economy. And sitting that out would be basically dooming us to sort of a sunset economy and not being able to dictate the terms of it, which is basically what you see happening where, a combination of factors, including a fight between Russia and the Saudis over oil prices, basically causes the entire provincial budget to collapse in the course of a couple of weeks. Is that a good place to be? Is that a leadership role to take? Or do we want to recognize, one, we have an obligation, and two, we have an opportunity to lead? But then beyond that, to come back to it, the idea that anyone's emissions don't matter is preposterous. It's a collective action problem. We all need to be part of the solution. One of the ways I like to think about it is, you hear a lot about, we need a war footing to beat the climate crisis. I kind of think of it more like almost like a Marshall Plan, where you've got the whole world hopefully making big investments, figuring out what is the stuff we do really well. We're not going to go out now and become, Canada's not going to be a major solar PV manufacturing country. That market has been built and has matured. China is going to lead that. There'll be a handful of other countries that make solar panels. But what is it that we can do that no one else can do that will be able to, is it geothermal? Is it carbon sequestration? Is it something else that we haven't even thought of yet? So I think the idea that, we only have to solve our problem and our problem's too small to worry about is just a very narrow and scientifically invalid way of thinking about the nature of the problem that we're dealing with.
So a lot of people have questions about political will and how to make change. And, you obviously talked about, well, you sit down with people and you have a beer and you get them bought in. And of course, if this was an easy political problem to solve, we would have done it already.
Exactly.
But perhaps you could say a bit more about what it's going to take to move the dial on this, particularly in Alberta.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to recognize, or one of the things I like to recognize first off, whenever we talk about the political will to change, too often, particularly if you're in the circle of people who think that we're not doing enough, we need to be moving faster, we've really dragged our feet on this, we're dooming the future to failure or whatever else, there's a tendency to kind of hand wave past it. To kind of say, hey, we've got the technology, we know we need to change, the leaders simply have to do it. And yes, that is, as a citizens of a democracy, that's what we do, is tell our leaders to do it. The idea that that is a simple thing to do and not the single most politically complex thing that any modern society has ever attempted to do is one that I would like to disabuse if anyone still has. It's hugely difficult. You are asking from the political sphere, you're saying, we want to make big changes that you don't understand for a problem you can't see and don't necessarily feel, and that you may never see the benefit of in any material sense. You're not you cutting your emissions. I mean, a great example actually would be something like the wildfires in Australia. Did the wildfires in Australia lead the Australians to begin, barking at their government a bit more about its terrible, terrible climate policies? Yes. Will it lead to a huge sweeping change because everyone understands the urgency of the problem now? No, because you can't rally the Australian people and say, hey, if we change government in 2 years or whatever, there'll be no more wildfires. You can't make that promise because the problem is too complex and too large and involves the entire Earth. And so that makes it hugely difficult. You basically have to sell it politically with something other than the usual kind of incentive relationship. And that's why you get, extremely messy politics, and why actually, Canada does have world-leading policies in some spheres. Our carbon pricing policies, our coal phase-out, and the speed with which it's moving. These are not, slack policies at all. They're world-leading policies, and it has been because we've mostly been able to very slowly cobble together a general agreement in a direction, and mostly been able to sort of move in that direction by fits and starts. Until very recently, over this pitch battle mainly around pipelines. But we shouldn't look at that and think, why are we so bad at this? It's that's what it looks like everywhere. I mean, there's a reason why, to use another example, why Germany is, although it's a world leader in a lot of things, actually has sort of flat emissions right now. And the reason is they decided to phase out nuclear ahead of coal. And they didn't do that for climate reasons. They did that because any politician in Germany who said, I'm keeping the nuclear plants open after Fukushima would be out on their ass at the next election. Guaranteed 100%. Germany's entire green movement is built on an anti-nuclear movement that is ferocious and absolutely unyielding. There would be no governing Germany if you did not do something about the nuclear plants. And so they basically squandered a decade of emissions cuts to satisfy the anti-nuclear lobby. So it's not just us that are doing this badly, it's that it's really, really hard to do. And that's where I wind up talking a lot about doing things much better. You sell Teslas not by telling people that they can shrink their carbon footprint, but by telling them, isn't this a great car? And I think a lot of the incentive to change will be that way. How can we, doesn't this do this better? Isn't this just a much more reliable, more exciting, more vain way to do things? That will sell as much of this stuff, I think, as scaring people to death about it. Not that we shouldn't be scared, but you can't govern fear for inevitably, particularly if you can't actually. I mean, to come back to the thing I said off the top, you can do the stuff that we're doing around the coronavirus because you can promise people it's temporary, and that where we get to is better than where we are right now, and on a fairly short time frame. I mean, we're looking right now at things like the difference between South Korea and Italy in terms of new cases, and saying if we all suck it up and there's going to be no sports for a while, and we're not going to go to the theater and don't go to the movies and bunker down, and your kids are going to be home from school for a couple of weeks, we'll probably see real change, within a couple of months. You can't make that promise on climate change, so you have to sell it some other way. And building that political will is extremely difficult. I'm a bit biased because I'm close to it, but I don't think there's any more complex problem in politics today. There might be bigger, more pressing ones. There might be healthcare is extraordinarily complex to administrate, that kind of thing. But that fact that you are asking your current electorate to do things on behalf of vague others, not that's really whenever. Is a really, really hard thing to navigate politically. And to be honest, I think part of the reason why Canada has sort of a leadership role is most of the European countries, for example, have kind of talked past their own fossil fuels. The ones that, Norway, world leader, and they save their money properly and all that. Sure, they're also still drilling in the North Sea. And they just kind of walk by that. They're like, yeah, we're doing that now. But that's not where our future is. And we weren't able to kind of just walk past in part because we are a federation and not a unified state and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so we have these regions pitted against each other and haves and have-nots and the rest of it, and who should pay and who should sacrifice, and it's messy stuff.
So maybe related to that, there is a way in which the story of the oil sands has become kind of iconic for what needs to happen and what's wrong.
Right.
So I know that you write about in your book how that came to be, but that's a question here. So how is it that the oil sands sort of stands as the marker of this?
Yeah, as our Mayor Nenching, Calgary used to say when it was sort of at its fever pitch, why is that one, 18-inch pipeline made to carry the entire sins of the global fossil fuel economy is one way to think of it. And I think it was because a couple of things. Part of it was that it was it gave people a discrete place to organize. So one of the things that had been really, really hard for people who were trying to advocate for more action on climate change was that it was hard to point at a thing and say, we're against this or we're for that. You just sort of wanted people to do we need to do a whole comprehensive bunch of policy stuff. And that was very hard to organize around. It was hard to get donations around if you were a nonprofit doing advocacy work in that sphere, et cetera. And so, but the idea of organizing around a single discrete project, that's a thing. Environmental groups know how to do that. They're very good at it. Their donors understand it. You had this one particular pipeline at that particular time when they were really looking, particularly in the United States. And by the way, I always feel like I have to preface this. There was no grand conspiracy led by the Rockefellers or anyone else to landlock our oil. There was widespread growing opposition to the pace and scale of oil sands growth that was sort of diffuse, and it eventually coalesced around first Keystone XL and then pipeline projects generally. That was not something that was brought to us by American money. It was sort of a widespread thing. And Keystone XL, because it was two things. One, it had no constituency in the U.S., so it wasn't really benefiting anyone in the U.S. You didn't have American oil companies saying, don't touch that thing. And then two, it was a presidential veto. You didn't have to lobby Congress. You didn't have to get 51 senators to agree to a thing. All you had to do is convince the president that it was in his best interest to not approve this thing. And that galvanized the sort of climate opposition in a way that, to my mind, eventually did become too focused on the one thing at the expense of the larger movement. I don't the oil sands in and of themselves are not where we make or break. They're a piece of it, but it's 3 million barrels of oil in a 95 to 100 million barrel a day world. It's mainly because of all the reasons it took so long to develop, market forces will drive it out of business faster than protesters probably can. If it comes to that, it's the most expensive, among the most expensive, and among the most emitting. So it's got its own problems anyway, and it shouldn't, to my mind, be the kind of poster child for the whole mess. But it is, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle, or however you want to think about it. That's where we now begin that conversation in Alberta and in Canada, is with this kind of baggage that we have to, slowly try and change some of the conversation around. And it's a really tricky thing to do once it's in the room that way. But yeah, I think it happened for some. And then the one piece I will say though is I do think. Government at the provincial level, to some degree at the federal level, industry to some degree, as I sort of said, didn't realize where it had gone. They were used to, for example, and I talk about this in the patch, there was a very collegial atmosphere between the provincial government and the oil sands industry and the oil and gas sector generally in this province. Everyone knew each other. People moved from private sector to public sector and back again. We all know how it's got to be. We'll all, if an environmental problem arises, we'll get together and make sure that we're, doing at least a little bit of what we need to do to address it. We all trust each other. We're this scrappy little thing anyway that no one pays attention to up in the forest of northern Alberta. And suddenly to be on this sort of global stage with, UN climate conferences and international protest, and they just were very quickly out of their depth from a story point of view and didn't realize it until far too late. In some cases, as I say, I would argue, still don't realize it. That the way they talk about, even when they're being 100% truthful and making valid points, it's just not sort of resonant in the conversation that they are trying to have, or trying to interject into, I guess. And so, yeah, that's where we find ourselves.
So people are also interested in personally making a difference. So not all of us can afford a Tesla or solar panels on our roofs, although that's getting more affordable. Yeah. But what kinds of things can people do that folks with a less rich bank account might be able to afford? But then also, what sorts of public policies would we need to encourage us to do that?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's two sides to that. I mean, the one side of it is that to be honest, what you individually can do, and I never want to be harsh about this, but like so much of the conversation goes there. In a sense, I think of it as, we had a big wave of climate protest and we got a plastic straw ban out of it. Because that was a thing everyone could do. And it doesn't really matter all that much. Which is not to say it's not yes, use fewer plastic straws, great, but that's not where we're going to make or break this thing. Where we make or break this thing is by people getting together and demanding better policies and voting for people who advocate for those policies and turn them into laws, and and working for companies that do the right thing, for profit-making reasons or otherwise. So I would say my answer, to what can I personally do? I mean, do the things that you feel like you want to do in your daily life. Often that are better, just plain better anyway. To my, if you like, you want to exercise every day, bike to work, great. Advocate for more than that. Advocate for your neighborhood or city to have better infrastructure for walking and cycling and transit. That's a really good thing. One of my sort of default examples of this in a lot of North American cities, the single biggest thing you could sort of do, not quite individually, but at your sort of community scale, would be to advocate for more residential density in your neighborhood, in most neighborhoods in North America. Because it's a thing we fought against forever that is still really hard to do in most North American cities, and which has a huge climate. Like the city of Berkeley, California, did an audit of, next 20 years, what's the best bang for our buck in terms of actual emissions reduction? What if we had a subsidy on solar cars? Or, electric cars. What if we had a subsidy on solar panels? What if we had energy efficiency stuff, whatever? And by far the single biggest thing they could do would be to change density, to change bylaws, which is, what is it, 15 people on Edmonton's council? If you can get 8 of them, is it 15? It's 15 in Calgary. Anyway, if you can get 8 of them to agree on that, you can really make a difference. That's not huge beyond your scale to think of. So that's sort of the one side of it, I would say, is that the best thing you can do is find other people who agree with you and advocate for change without, again, not wanting to discount the stuff people do in their daily lives, but not wanting to overemphasize that, I think, is my big thing. What was the second half of the question?
So more about what sorts of policies.
Policies,
So
yeah.
somebody asked a question about contributing electricity back to the grid, and
Yeah.
we have a system that doesn't actually allow us to do that.
Yeah, so things like that, looking at where are the roadblocks, but also, there's a lot of extremely low-hanging fruit on things like urban density and energy efficiency. The by far, and even like that Generation Energy Council I was on, the energy efficiency people were like they were almost like a support group for like how no one pays any attention to them. They never get the sort of glossy features and the TV interviews and whatever. And like a third of Canada's Paris commitment could be achieved by simply doing what the provinces have already said they would do on efficiency. If they actually just implement what they've said they were going to do in 2016 on efficiency, there's a third of our Paris commitment. And efficiency is not super sexy, but it is also a thing that you can do at every scale of government. You can do in your home, you can do in a business, you can do in a neighborhood. There are audit kits, most governments have programs. Alberta still has one hanging on by a thread. It officially exists, but it doesn't have much, it's just kind of there waiting to see what will happen to it. So maybe talk to your MLA about bringing back the Energy Efficiency Alberta or something like it. But yeah, there are things at scale below, Paris targets and national carbon prices and that we can do that are just as important, and I think don't get the attention that the sort of the big carbon tax fights and stuff like that do. But and also where mostly there aren't many politicians, for example, who are openly against efficiency. They might sometimes do things that don't encourage it, but they're not against it as a thing. Like they're not, whereas like, it's going to be very hard to unravel the carbon price thing and have conservatives come back around to the idea that it makes sense, even like from their worldview, to put a price on carbon, that it was, it's an essentially conservative policy. I don't know if we'll ever get back to that. We may just keep fighting past it till it doesn't matter anymore. But you can usually get buy-in on stuff like efficiency and certain kinds of new transport options and that kind of thing. So look for stuff in your community that you can change on a reasonable timescale. In part because it also gives you that really great sense, which is often lacking in these conversations, of getting a thing done. Otherwise, and this was actually to come back to the previous question, one of the big things with pipelines versus other climate advocacy, the pipeline people could actually win and then stand there and go, we stopped a thing. And that was incredibly powerful for a fight that had been just totally amorphous for 20 years. And particularly in the United States, where climate advocates felt like when Obama came to power, we've got our guy, he's going to be able to make some really great changes. And then the 2010 climate talks in Copenhagen just were a total failure. That was probably the low point globally on coordinated climate. It was a real, it was a disheartening moment sort of across the board worldwide. And this was this place where they could actually look at it, find a thing and organize around it and win. So, yeah.
So I want to ask you about both youth and Indigenous people. Right. Both groups who have been very inspirational and perhaps very frustrating, depending on where you sit on the debate. But how to harness the energy of youth in this struggle, and how do we think about Indigenous people in relation to green transition, right, etc.
Well, I think in terms of the youth movement, it has been enormously inspiring for a lot of people, I think. It, among other things, found a way to galvanize public attention and public protest on climate change that didn't fall into, has a little bit, but never really fell completely into right, left, our party, your party. It was just kids saying, what about our future? And that turned out to be, I don't know if it was just timing or, there was a whole bunch of elements that Greta Thunberg has a particular kind of energy that really is very hard, is very compelling and very hard to push back against on some of the classic ways that politicians in this sphere have tried to. But for whatever reason, a thing that we were talking about, took years and years for climate advocates to get a little bit of organized political push on these issues, and a bunch of teenagers did it in a couple of months, and it's by far the most effective political organizing around climate change anyone's done to date. How do you harness that energy? I don't know. I think try and not get in its way to begin with, if you want to, if you're in favor of what they're doing. If you think that and I would probably fall in this camp, like when you're 16, you can say I want the entire world to change tomorrow, and why aren't you doing it? And that's a compelling argument in and of itself. If you're, working in these worlds, whether it's in the energy industry or in politics or whatever, you recognize there's a lot more complexity to these things. But you can absolutely, try as best you can to bring that point of view and bring that voice into the conversation that you're having about the more complex whatever. And I've seen that actually. You see that at clean energy conferences now. There's just sort of this acknowledgement. We've got this sort of wind in our sails now. That's coming from this youth movement that's really powerful, and let's try not to squander it, and but also without trying, never mistaking it for our own. It's its own political force, and it will do what it wants, I guess, is one way of putting it. As far as Indigenous participation, it's a thing, fortunately, that doesn't just get talked about a lot, that actually happens. There's First Nations have become leaders in renewable energy development and other kind of stuff like this. It still falls under the same very, very problematic kind of political structure of the Indian Act, and the difficulty of deciding who, for example, I could point to like one of the few wind energy developments in Ontario that didn't get kind of massive pushback from the public is on First Nations land outside of Sault Ste. Marie. And it was developed by a First Nation. Not only are they part owners of it, but they now train other First Nations in renewable energy development. As in a lot of ways, a good news story. But there's absolutely people in the Indigenous community who feel like this is still a very sort of patriarchal, the government giving us a thing and telling us to go do it, and not actually letting us do what we want to as communities. So I mainly mentioned that Indigenous politics are incredibly complex, and so I wouldn't want to say, well, let's just give them all wind turbines and solar panels, because clearly they like. But that has been a big piece of the success story of small-scale renewable energy development in Canada, is that it is a way to give direct ownership to First Nations and to give real opportunity for job training and the rest of it. Again, I think probably it's good advice to try not to get in the way of that, and to let insofar as we can, policy-wise and the rest of it, enable First Nations to make those decisions for themselves. What kind of developments they want, how they want them to go forward. You now have a generation of increasing expertise in the Indigenous community. So what does it, how is there a way to kind of, properly engage that voice and let it sort of speak to us about what they want to do, rather than us, and as we have historically, sort of tell First Nations what piece of this opportunity they might get. So that's not and I think the main thing there is to recognize that a business opportunity in and of itself is not reconciliation, and so you'll be open to the complexity of that going into these kind of conversations, rather than assuming, well, there's money in it for you. Why, how could it be wrong, or how could it be bad for you, or whatever, and yeah.
So we're almost out of time, but there's a really generous question in this pile, which is, what are you going to work on next, and how can we help you?
Well, that is a very generous question. You help me by buying books. This is a really good time. We're all going to have to spend a lot of time at home. This should be the golden age of reading in Canada. I continue to do what I'm doing. I'm discussing with my publisher another book, which is basically hoping to kind of distill some of the more complex stuff that these sort of longer books have talked about into something that's a lot quicker and tighter and funner a read. For people. So when that comes out, buy it. I would say, what I've tried to do as as sort of journalistically honestly as possible, is find things that seem like they're working and point at them and say, here's how it works. Maybe we could do more of this. So if you're interested in the stuff I talk about, the stuff I write about, tell people about it and do more of it. I guess that would be. I mean, I'm not trying to build a constituency here, and I'm just trying to point people in good directions, or what I think are good directions, in the midst of a really, really messy and complex conversation. So, yeah, if you like the stuff, go for it. And I have actually had the extraordinary honor of having people, come up to me at, after events and things like that, often at industry stuff, which is great, and say, hey, I read your book 10 years ago, and that was when I decided to go into renewable energy, or whatever. And I mean, that's the best compliment I could possibly get for the work I've done. So
that's great. That's great. So I would like to invite you all to thank Chris for this wonderful talk. I also want to thank you all for these fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but hopefully there was enough of a representative sampling that we put Chris through his paces. It seemed a bit like a dissertation defense to me, so well done, Chris.
Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Chris.
And the one thing everyone can do as you leave is wash your hands.